You're muted.
So I have it's 6 o'clock. I'm the executive director for Alberta Wilderness Association. We're very happy to have a specialist speak to us tonight. I'm going to have our conservation specialist, Ruping Luo, introduce our speaker.
Okay. Hi. So thank you for coming. I just want to introduce our speaker. Dr. Matthew Scrafford is a conservation specialist with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada and leads the Wolverine and Caribou Research Program. He works to advance the understanding and conservation of wolverines and caribou in Alberta and Ontario. With WCS Canada, he led a 7-year wolverine study in Red Lake, Ontario, using radiotelemetry and camera trapping. The study documented effects of human disturbance on abundance, distribution, survival, and denning of the species. Currently, he is leading winter aerial surveys for wolverine and caribou tracks to understand long-term changes in their distribution, and camera trapping to determine how caribou predators use decommissioned forestry roads. So Matt has worked with the U.S. Forest Service on wildlife research projects in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and as a U.S. Forest Service hotshot on wildfires in Arizona and Montana. He received his MSc at Montana State University, where he studied the ecology of reintroduced beavers north of Yellowstone National Park, and his PhD from the University of Alberta, where his research focused on wolverine ecology in industrialized habitats of northern Alberta. His last study with his PhD on and his work with radiotelemetry in Ontario contributed hugely to the understanding of wolverine ecology in boreal forests with industrial development. So we first met when we were discussing some of the recent changes in Alberta that most people have no doubt heard about by now, and Dr. Scrafford was able to provide a lot of his expertise. So with that, I really look forward to your presentation today, and I will turn it over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks a lot. Um, yeah, and I think the screen's working, and if it's not, I guess just let me know. So yeah, my name's Matt Scrafford. I work with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and yeah, this talk was about is about wolverine ecology and conservation research in the boreal forests. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the organization that I work for, Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. So we are a non-governmental organization. We WCS Canada actually WCS is actually a global organization, mostly focusing on research and on threatened and endangered species in developing countries. But there are programs in Canada and as well as the United States. The basic idea is with WCS Canada and WCS in general is to generate, share, and apply science and expert opinion to achieve conservation results. I think one of the unique aspects of WCS Canada is that idea of generating science. We have a lot of field projects. That's kind of our bread and butter, is going into the field, doing research projects, and then applying that data and expertise to the conservation of wildlife. In Ontario, where I work, mostly right now, I focus on 3 wildlife species. Our program does caribou, wolverine, and lake sturgeon, and some of the far north related policies, such as species at risk policies, impact assessment, as well as landscape planning, land use planning. That graph in the bottom right there, that is kind of showing the distribution of people that work for WCS Canada. I'm based here in Thunder Bay, and there's about 20 of us here. We have another office in Whitehorse that's fairly large. Here in Thunder Bay, we're working on the Ontario Northern Boreal program. Out in Whitehorse, they have the Northern Boreal Mountain program. There's also a Arctic program. Here's some examples of some field projects we have. We have a bat program in the Rocky Mountains, in Alberta and BC. We have a sturgeon program, freshwater program, where we work with the Moose Creek First Nation. It's co-led with the Indigenous community there, looking at sturgeon response to hydropower. And then we have an Arctic program, like for example, a bioacoustics program. But yeah, lots of field research, and then we apply that data to species at risk conservation and management. How do we apply that data? Well, we do peer-reviewed publications. That's a big part, as scientists. We also, how I kind of got in contact with AWA was through writing an op-ed for the Edmonton Journal on trapping. So that's another way that we communicate our science and our knowledge. And then through commentary on policy and impact environmental assessments, we do quite a bit of that work as well. So yeah, today, I was going to talk a bit about wolverines, which is a species that I've worked with quite a bit. I was going to start with kind of a general background and conservation status. But wolverines, they exist at fairly low densities, maybe somewhere between 2 and 10 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. They have fairly large home ranges. A male might have a home range that's 1,000 square kilometers, and a female maybe 300 square kilometers. Within a male's home range, there might be multiple females that he breeds with, but every adult generally has intersexual territoriality. Males have home ranges that do not overlap with other males, and females have home ranges that don't generally overlap with other females, at least adult females. They have fairly low reproductive rates. Females are generally having kits maybe every 1 or 2 years, and maybe only 1 or 2 of them survive into adulthood, and even fewer of those are females, which are going to provide reproduction for future years. So a very, very low reproductive rates. They're adapted to live in cold and snowy places. They have lots of morphological and physiological adaptations for that. They have a very thick and stocky build, helps them retain heat. They have a very muscular head, allows them to, they often scavenge, and they're chewing on icy carcasses and things like that. They're able to really crunch through that bone to get marrow or to get meat. They have a plantigrade step, which reduces foot loading. And they have paws, and also paws like snowshoe that kind of help them float over the surface of the snow. Yeah, and where they live is generally these cold and snowy northern climates. So you find them in the northern parts of Europe, Fennoscandia, Russia, and in North America. You kind of find them in you can organize them into 3 different ecosystems that they generally do pretty well in. One is the mountain or the alpine tundra. You'll find that, for example, in Western Canada, down into the contiguous US. The boreal forest, which is mostly where I've done my work. And then you'll also find them in the Arctic tundra. These places are generally associated with wilderness type of environments. Wilderness is generally defined as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrampled by man, where man itself is a visitor who does not remain. So as a wilderness species, wolverines are often suggested to require some of these habitats that have minimal human disturbance. Kasiwick, for example, in their status assessment, said the wolverine needs vast, undisturbed areas to maintain viable populations. Obviously, the issue now is we are getting more and more human developments into what was once intact wild places. This graphic here shows the amount of fragmented habitat in Canada. The blue areas are intact and the hotter colors are less intact. And you can see the southern boreal, for example, where I work is becoming more and more fragmented by um, industrial development, resource extraction like forestry and mining. You know, you see there's not a lot of reduction in intactness, for example, in the mountains of BC and Alberta, with roads and communities there, and then of course the prairies. But you know, this is expanding further north. For example, in Ontario, there's a proposal to develop the Ring of Fire. It has lots of chromite and nickel in northern Ontario. Northern Ontario is a very intact boreal forest at this point, but that Ring of Fire mine and the development associated with it and the access roads has the potential to really change the nature of that landscape. So there's a lot of risks to wolverines in that wilderness that they need. Primary threats to wolverines from a historical perspective: unregulated trapping. Um, you know, no trapping season. That was a risk to the species. Poisoning, not necessarily poisoning for wolverines, but poisoning for wolves. For the most part, poisoning, for example, carcasses that were meant to kill wolves, but it, you know, got wolverines as well. Decreased abundance of their prey, whether that be beaver, moose, or caribou. Land conversion, so you know, industrial or human settlement, in essence, like the prairies and other places, you know, large human settlement of North America. Present day, industrial disturbance continues to be, you know, a big issue for this species. This occurs throughout a fairly broad part of wolverine range. It's not quite the intensity that, for example, human settlement has, but it is occurring in a larger. It's a bit more ubiquitous. Fur harvest. This continues to be an issue. Obviously, trapping regulations have gone a long way to protect wolverines. You can only trap during a certain period of the year when the fur is in best shape, but fur harvest and it continues to be an issue for wolverines in some places. Recreation. A big issue that a lot of researchers have worked on in Alberta and BC in the mountains there, snowmobiling and backcountry skiing and hiking and recreation overall is something, a non-lethal effect of human activity is a non-lethal effect, in effect distribution and abundance of the species. And then climate change, there are cold and snow adapted species. Winters are getting warmer and snow less predictable. It's having an effect on reproduction and physiological stress, and could have a big effect on the species. We are starting to learn more and more about these threats, and that is mostly a lot of that research is occurring in the mountains relative to the boreal forests and the Arctic tundra. This is a map. The stars are just where field research has occurred. And in a lot of these field programs have looked at the effects of human disturbance on wolverine populations. You can see there's lots of field studies in the mountains around you know, Banff and Jasper and into BC. You know, why is that? Well, those areas are near human population centers, they're near universities. That probably has something to do with it. But there's also a lot of threats to those populations. Those populations exist fairly close to human population centers, lots of people using those areas, lots of resource extraction. And that continues down into the contiguous United States. Much less research occurs in the boreal forest and the Arctic tundra, but I think that will start to change as human development expands into those areas and threats become more significant. This is a graph. On the y-axis is the number of peer-reviewed publications looking at human disturbance, and on the x is year. In the last 25 years, there's been a fairly large increase in the number of peer-reviewed publications looking at the effects of human disturbance on wolverines. Which has allowed us to better understand threats and to assess the species. A lot of these studies have occurred, like we were saying, in the where the field studies are, like the mountain ecosystems. A lot of these look at local distribution and abundance, as well as human-caused mortality and broad-scale distribution. Fennoscandia studies also tend to look at broad-scale distribution and human-caused mortality pretty closely, although they have slightly different, the nature of their threats are slightly different. But much of our knowledge base is, and what we've been looking at is in the Wolverine research community is effects of human disturbance on local distribution. So using this information, Wolverines have been assessed by CSIWIC. This was last done in 2014 under the Species at Risk Act, and Wolverines got a status of special concern, meaning they may become threatened or endangered because of biological characteristics. So for example, their low reproductive rates, low densities, and some of the identified threats that we just went over. They have different provincial or territorial statuses throughout Canada. In Ontario, for example, they've been assessed as threatened. And so looking more closely at the Alberta wolverine population, they have been assessed as data deficient since about 2001. I think at one time they were, much more present throughout the entirety of the province. Some of the best habitat we think for the species, according to that ABMI model, is in that northwest portion of the province. That's also where you get some of the most trapping returns. That's where I did some of my PhD research. On the right there is a graphic that just shows where trappers are most likely to see wolverines in Alberta. And again, it kind of correlates with that habitat map. You're much more likely to see wolverines kind of in the northwest and the northern parts of the province than you are to see them in the in some of that transition from the parkland up to the boreal. And then you'll see them quite a bit out in the Rockies. In Ontario, wolverines are threatened. They were province-wide before European settlement. By the 1900s, wolverines are mostly found north of the far north line. And by the 70s, they were found mostly in kind of isolated regions in northern Ontario, northwest Ontario specifically. This is a map that shows, it's a heat map that shows where you're most likely to see wolverine tracks. So my colleague, Justina Ray, she's the president of WCS Canada. She flew surveys between about 2005 and 2012 looking for wolverine tracks in the snow, and built an occupancy model based on that. And this is where the hotter colors are indicative of where you're most likely to see tracks. And so, yeah, in the 70s, maybe they were just based in that northwest corner of the province, but we think they've increased a little bit since that time into north central and some southern parts of Ontario. So my research program at WCS Canada includes 3 scientists right now, and there's 2 students. So we're looking at wolverine, and we also do some caribou studies as well. The data that we are all working with is mostly focused on 2 camera and GPS collaring projects for wolverines. Was in Rainbow Lake, Alberta between 2013 and 2016. And then another GPS collaring project in Red Lake, Ontario between 2018 to 2022. So the rest of the presentation will mostly focus on some of the analyses and outputs that we've had from those 2 studies. We also are doing some aerial surveys for wildlife tracks in the snow. So we're repeating some of the surveys that were done previously about 20 years ago, to look at any changes in distribution. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then we're doing a fairly large road camera trapping project for caribou. I won't talk much about that, but yeah, the focus of this presentation is kind of beyond some comparisons in the ecology of the species between this Red Lake area in northwest Ontario and Rainbow Lake in northwest Alberta. These sites are obviously they're both boreal sites. One's on the shield and one's on the plains, but um, they have slightly different kind of threats and industrial footprints. Um, for example, forestry is a big part of Red Lake. There's lots of forestry activity in Red Lake. In Rainbow Lake, it's principally oil and gas extraction as well as a little bit of forestry. But you can see both of these areas have a fairly significant human footprint. For example, Rainbow Lake has a seismic line density of nearly 7 kilometers of road per square kilometer, has nearly 0.41 well sites per square kilometers. Um, Red Lake has quite a bit of harvest area in it, and both of them have lots of roads. Topographic ruggedness, Red Lake has a lot of rock and structure. It's shield country. Rainbow Lake is a little bit flatter and swampier. A lot more streams in Red Lake relative to Rainbow Lake, and particularly a lot of lakes in Red Lake in the Red Lake area. Road density is fairly similar between the two areas, but overall presentation is going to kind of look at a comparison of the ecology and some of our findings from these two places. And a lot of these data, they're going to come from telemetry studies that we did. So we set out a system of live traps, and we tag these wolverines, and we attach GPS collars to them and track them through the bush to try to learn about foraging and reproduction and habitat selection and movement. This is quite an effort. Wolverines go into live traps at all times of the day, and we had to be able to get out there at all times. So yeah, we had big dedicated field crews that worked really hard to try to collect some of these data. Here are some of the GPS data in Rainbow Lake. You can see, I think we had about 45,000 GPS locations at 2-hour intervals from about 45 individuals. Lots of information that we got on that of Wolverine's distribution and movement between Alberta as well as into BC, and then some fairly significant dispersals, for example, up into the Northwest Territories. And Red Lake, yeah, similar. These GPS collars were placed on the Wolverines, and they recorded GPS locations at 2-hour intervals. I think we ended up with about 70,000 GPS locations there from about 53 individuals. So the data sets are fairly similar in size and the number of individuals. But overall, within the literature in North America, there's nothing that really compares to this level of information for GPS collaring. So we've been able to learn quite a bit about wolverine ecology in the boreal forest. You see in Red Lake, we've had a lot of dispersals. Wolverines have moved, from example, the Red Lake area up to Lake Winnipeg, and a female dispersed a couple 100 kilometers to Muskrat Dam Lake and over into Armstrong area. So lots of interesting movements from these individuals. So I want to compare wolverine ecology between the boreal forest in Ontario and Alberta, and then focus on comparisons in abundance distribution, denning, foraging, trapping, and physiology. And then talk a little bit about this idea of wolverines as a wilderness species. Why are we interested in abundance? It's important for assessing conservation or population status. It's a big input into some of these documents, government assessment documents. We might also be interested in assessing change over time. So we get 2 time stamps for an abundance estimate or a distribution estimate, and we want to look at how the population is faring over that time. We might want to be able to determine the number of individuals affected by mining or other development projects. For example, a minimal population that might be living in these areas. We're often asked to provide that type of information to project proponents, industrial. And overall, population estimates are fairly scarce throughout Wolverine range. So any information we can produce on population abundance is very important for Wolverine conservation. And is particularly important in the boreal forest, where we have very little information on the species. So how do we detect wolverines? We have for one, we use run poles, and maybe some of the people on this call are familiar with these run poles, but that's kind of a schematic on the left. A wolverine, we hang some beaver bait from a piece of wire, and the wolverines running around the bush, and they smell that wire, or they smell that beaver, and they jump onto this pole, and they try to access that beaver. And when they do, a camera opposite the pole takes a picture of the wolverine. And wolverines have unique chest patterns that allow us to identify individuals, or they leave a DNA sample in those alligator clips. Or maybe they're wearing an ear tag or a GPS collar that allows us to identify an individual. Here's a wolverine in Ontario climbing up onto a run pole, and you can see a nice view of that chest picture as it tries to get up there. You can also learn a bit about the reproductive status of wolverines when they go up onto these run poles. This female, for example, has teats, so you know that she's reproductive and has kits nearby. We've included a lot of indigenous communities in the work that we've done, including Matawa students here that helped with some of our work in Red Lake. They helped set up these run poles and took part in a lot of our telemetry work. We also detect wolverines by setting up these live traps. So yes, you can trap these individuals and then put collars on them and track them after, but you also get individual IDs from catching them in the live trap. You can get pictures. For example, that picture on the left, you can see a chest pattern. You can also see an ear tag and a GPS collar. It can tell us what the individual is as they go in and out of those live traps. Here's more examples of that. Kind of these live traps, in essence, acting like a run pole, providing us information on detecting and the detection and the number of individuals. So this is the grid of live traps and run poles that we have between Red Lake and Rainbow Lake. You can see Rainbow Lake's a little bit more in the core of Wolverine Range, and Red Lake's a little bit more on the edge. But we have these run poles and live traps distributed throughout the study area, spaced anywhere between 10 and 10 to 20 kilometers apart, I'd say. We use these to create a grid of capture histories of the individual movement between these live traps and run poles. Here's an example, zoomed in example of Red Lake. We have, I think there's about 30 run poles, or 30 live traps, and about 10 run poles overall in that landscape. The grid covered about a 6,000 square kilometer area, and our density estimate in that area was about 26,000 square kilometers. And this is an example of creating a capture history based on run poles and live traps. These are individuals moving between these live traps. So we're getting the idea of an individual moving between different detectors, live traps or run poles. That's allowing us to kind of estimate these activity centers for these individuals and get an estimate of density or abundance. And what we found is in Rainbow Lake, in that 19,000 square kilometer area, we ended up detecting about 48 individuals. 19 of those were females, 18 were males, and 11 were unknown. Ended up with a density of roughly 6.34 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. In Red Lake, about 27,000 square, our density estimate was over about a 27,000 square kilometer space. 56 individuals, 17 females, 32 males, and 7 unknown. And our density estimate was about 3.48 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. So a bit of a higher density in Rainbow Lake relative to Red Lake. We can't really know exactly why the density is much higher in Rainbow than it is in Red Lake. We have kind of some ideas. One of those is, I mentioned this earlier, Rainbow Lake is much more towards the core of Wolverine Range. I would say the core is kind of, the Yukon and Northwest Territories, and maybe some northern parts of BC and Alberta up in the Boreal. And I think, Rainbow Lake is much closer to that core, and you might have a slightly higher abundance because the environmental conditions are best for them there. Red Lake is on the edge of what is today current wolverine distribution. It was even somewhat close to the edge of what historical wolverine distribution is. So the environmental conditions might not be quite as good to support a larger population. But our study didn't really look at that question. And but talk a little bit about differences in distribution between Ontario Wolverines and Alberta Wolverines. So why we're interested in distribution. It informs response to industrial disturbance. For example, we can understand how the effect of like a pipeline or the effect of a oil and gas well, how that affects the behavior and the distribution of the species. We can also look at the effects of forest management plans and forest management planning, and that's something I look at quite a bit. How is forestry affecting the landscape, and how are wolverines responding to that in their distribution? It also informs whether caribou an adequate umbrella species for wolverines. There's not much done for wolverines at a landscape scale um, as far as habitat management. Much of the habitat management for in the habitats where wolverines exist is for caribou, and so wolverines are often thought to be covered by caribou, and I think that's an interesting research question if those habitat management strategies for caribou also apply well to wolverine. And we can look at change in distribution over time. So some of our research has looked at wolverine behavior near human disturbance. Some of this came um, from Northwest Alberta. Our research indicates, and that of others indicates, that wolverine avoid roads and industrial features. And I think this is particularly for females. I think you see that in the boreal forest where we're working, but you also see that in some of the studies that have occurred in the mountains out west. Females are particularly sensitive to industrial disturbance, and they will avoid those features. Areas with lots of human activity tend to have a more pronounced behavioral effect. Um, as the level of human activity, as vehicle traffic, recreation increases on the landscape, it displaces wolverines to a greater extent and reduces habitat suitability. We've run a number of habitat selection models between Red Lake, comparing Red Lake and Rainbow Lake to try to see if there's any similarities or differences between the distribution of the species in those two places. We have a pretty good data set to do that. For example, we'll split females into summer and winter, as well as males into summer and winter, or we might look at all the data for the species combined and build models with all the data just kind of in one giant pool. But overall, we have a fairly decent data set to look at to build things like resource selection models or step selection functions or any of the kind of popular models you use to understand the distribution. What we found is that both species are both wolverines in both places, in Red Lake and Rainbow Lake, they show pretty strong selection for streams, wetland type habitat. As I'll talk about a little bit later, really important prey species for wolverine are beaver. So I think they're selecting for these streams because they're hunting beavers. But I think just like a lot of other species, streams are important movement corridors. So they're selecting for streams, and they're oftentimes moving faster when they get to them. So they're using them to move around on the landscape. But beavers I think are also a reason that they use those streams. You generally find them in conifer forests. If they have a choice between a broadleaf stand and a conifer stand, you're more likely than not going to find them in those conifer stands. So we saw that between both Red Lake and Rainbow Lake, and it's kind of similar to what you might see for caribou. These over 40 or over 60-year-old forests, these mature forests, are really important to wolverines in both Red Lake and in Rainbow Lake, and they're also pretty important to caribou. So that kind of gets at that question of, in part, that question of whether caribou management might help wolverines. In Rainbow Lake, Alberta, you see pretty strong selection for black spruce forests, particularly by males, and avoidance of untreed wetlands like bogs or fens. In Red Lake, you see pretty strong selection or use of black spruce forests as well as lakes um, and untreed wetlands. Lakes are very abundant in Red Lake, in the larger Red Lake area because it's boreal shield there, and there's lots of beavers that live on those lakes, on the edges of those lakes, and you'll often see wolverines running along the edges of the lake and hunting along those areas. Here, we did look a little bit at some changes in wolverine distribution over the last roughly 20-25 years, um, based on aerial surveys for wolverine tracks in the snow. And this was based on a study that was done in about 2005. Um, you can see that square is the study area around Red Lake. It's about a 60,000 square kilometer space between Pickle and Sioux Lookout and Woodland Caribou Park. So we flew surveys. WCS Canada flew surveys in that area in around 2005, and we're repeating those surveys now. And this is some of the places where they saw wolverine detections during that time. These were based on fixed wing flights. There's about 30 flight lines, so looking for tracks of wolverines as well as other species. So we're repeating those to look at change, and we found about 104 tracks of beavers and lots of caribou tracks, about 108 tracks of wolverine. We were about halfway done with these transects when we had this when we created these totals. We actually finished these transects just recently, so we're going to try to take a look at any change in distribution. But again, we see a lot of our tracks in the northern edge of the study area. And like if you're familiar with that area, Loch Sewell kind of tends to be a southern range boundary that they don't seem to move wolverines very far south of that area. Look at some comparisons now of denning. Why are we interested in denning? Forestry often protects, there's not a lot of landscape level management for wolverines, but forestry does often protect values such as dens. It's generally one of the only habitat management that's done for wolverines. We're involved in this quite a bit when we find a wolverine den in these study areas and they need to be protected. We're called in to provide some advice and data on how exactly to manage those areas. So we've spent quite a bit of time working with some of these dens and working to build some of these den site management plans. Overall, these den sites are very hard to find. You can find them sometimes with aerial surveys based on clusters of tracks, but telemetry is generally the best way to try to find a wolverine den site, particularly in a treed landscape. So you put a collar on an individual, and then you'll listen for telemetry, and you'll listen for the individual to locate its movements, and then you'll try to triangulate that location and figure out what kind of structure the individual is using. In Rainbow Lake, we found about 5 den sites. 2 were in forestry slash piles or log decks. 1 was in a beaver lodge. 1 was in a fallen tree or a root ball, and 1 was in a squirrel midden. In Red Lake, we found 13 den sites. 4 were in slash piles, 7 were in down trees, and 2 were in boulders. So between these 2 sites, you see a lot of use of structure. They're looking to place their dens in any of the structure that's available on the landscape. Here in Rainbow Lake in Alberta, we found, that's in top left, that's a female that was using a log deck or slash pile. The top right is actually the log deck, then squirrel middens, and then a beaver lodge den. In Red Lake, these are examples of wolverine using like a squirrel midden as a den site and a down tree. It was a big snow year to the right there, and the female dug a snow cave down into a down tree, and that was her den site. Again, slash piles are a really important part of, just like in Alberta, wolverines really use them in Ontario as well. Again, they're looking for structure, and it doesn't, these slash piles aren't next to like primary and all season roads. They're generally back tucked into the back of kind of grown in cut blocks. So they're relatively quiet areas. She also had some dendrites in down trees that were covered in snow. And here's a little bit of structure, like a moraine, a rock field that the female dug snow cave down into. This is very similar to what you might see in the Rocky Mountains, for example. Here's some down trees that a female used. At the time that she was denning, there was obviously a lot of snow in this area, and she was digging snow caves under these trees. F7 had a densite in a rock, um, in a rock formation. Obviously, this kind of thing is not really available in a place like Rainbow Lake. There's that type of rock structure is just not available to wolverines there. Again, slash piles and log decks were really important in Ontario for F10 and again for F11. And we've been working a little bit to try to, when these dendrites are found, there's an area of concern placed around them, like I had mentioned before, and these are usually 4-kilometer radius protections that are placed around the dendrites. We've been doing a little bit of work to try to kind of figure out whether those dendrites and those areas of concern, whether those areas of concern overlap with kind of core habitats that the females are using or core denning areas. Also just trying to understand whether these AOCs really do a good job of covering kind of the core habitats that a female uses throughout that denning period, to try to inform how big these AOCs should be. But talk a little bit here about foraging between Alberta and Ontario. Prairieville, why do we care about foraging? Prairieville is obviously pretty critical to reproduction, particularly females. They're pretty adept at killing snowshoe hare. So it's important to reproduction. We also need to know how industry and climate change might affect prey availability. Our research with GPS collars offers a really fine-grained look at foraging because these collars were taking locations at about 2-hour intervals and transmitting that to us the next day. So we could visit the very next day a site that the wolverine had been at, and we can not only find big items like a moose that a wolverine was like a wolf killed moose, but we can also find, for example, when it was feeding on a snowshoe hare or a grouse. So very small things. I think a lot of the previous studies have been based on VHF. A lot of the previous foraging studies have been based on VHF, and those studies are often just flying maybe once a day or once a month for the animal, and then they visit clusters of points where the animals spent a lot of time, but they're not necessarily going to pick up they're going to pick up big foraging sites in that scenario. They're not going to pick up some of these smaller foraging sites, which we were able to with these GPS Iridium uploads. Here's an example of a wolverine foraging site that we found. They kind of structure these sites. They have their their kill site, which is the beaver lodge, and they have passed from that kill site to a latrine that's often up in the trees along the edge of the riparian area. There's also bed sites there. So they kind of organize these areas to have areas where they eat and areas where they go to the bathroom and then areas where they have their bed site, and they're all kind of separated. But this is a pattern we almost always saw when we went to these kill sites is how they kind of structured them in this way. So here's a GPS cluster. So it's a concentration of GPS points. This wolverine was feeding on a black bear. This was in Red Lake. This was also in Red Lake. This is a wolverine that went into a cut block and was feeding on a moose. Here's a wolverine foraging on snowshoe hare. So it lived in that little structure there for almost a week. and would just on a daily basis, we think, go out and kill snowshoe hare, bring them back to that little structure there and eat them. And then it just kind of did that for a number of days. And actually, that was a female who was doing that, and then a male came in there as well. And they're also foraging on caribou. So a comparison between the two field sites, moose was really important in Red Lake. There's just a lot more moose there. I mean, I worked extensively in the field in both places, and your chance of crossing a moose track in Rainbow Lake was very low. In Red Lake, you saw moose tracks all the time. It's much more upland habitat. I think it's just better moose habitat there. And yeah, as a result, wolverines were predominantly in Red Lake feeding on moose. And in Rainbow Lake, it was it was still an important part of the diet, but not critical. In Rainbow Lake, beaver was a very important part of the wolverines diet, as well as snowshoe hare. And that was a bit less, hare was always important in Red Lake as well, but beaver were a little bit less important in Red Lake. And then all those other species as well. In Rainbow, we noticed that these aggregate pits or borrow pits were often filling up with water. Just that water table was so high out there, and the beavers were often colonizing these borrow pits, and the wolverines would go and check out these pits for beavers. We'd follow their tracks right to them. We actually had a wolverine that lived in the berm of a borrow pit for a number of days. It dug a little hole into these pits. So these borrow pits were actually basically creating beaver habitat on the landscape, and the wolverines were keying in on them. We noticed this early, and we ended up doing a whole bunch of surveys to understand the occupancy of these pits. And we found we did a random sample, and about 18% were active colonies at these borrow pits, and then at least 34% had evident cutting. So these pits, a lot of them were being used by beavers, and wolverines were interested in them as well. Talk a little bit about trapping. Wolverines have a limited ability to withstand trapping pressure. They occur at low densities. They have low reproductive rates. Roads are key here. I think roads provide a lot of access to wolverine habitats, for trappers to get into those areas and to trap. At a fine scale, you see a lot of evidence of wolverine decline in areas with active trapping. At a broad scale, it's a little bit harder to tell. In order to really understand that, you need really good estimates of broad scale abundance to understand what, you can look at how many individuals are in, say the province of Alberta, and then you can look at harvest, the number of wolverines that harvested. You can then somehow get like a harvest rate and say, if the harvest rate's high, say 15%, you can say at a broad scale, trapping is not sustainable. If the harvest rates are 5%, then you could maybe say that it is sustainable. But we just really, for the most part, don't have that really detailed information on abundance at that broad of a scale. Although we do have fairly good information on trapping limits in those areas. But trapping limits are the primary tool used by governments to protect wolverines, and they're generally based on when the fur's most profitable to harvest, and that's sometime between November and May, or between November and February or January. And there is in Alberta, you can take one wolverine per year per trap line. In Ontario, there is no commercial for ours. The wolverines are getting killed there incidentally in traps set for other species. A comparison between the two places. In Red Lake, we had, based on our telemetry data, we had 10 known mortalities. 6 were from fur harvest. Again, these were incidental. They were killed in sets for other species. 2 were from predators. So, and then 2 were from vehicles. But again, these all occurred along roads. The trappers' sets were along roads. The predators were using roads to travel, and they interacted with the wolverine, or obviously a vehicle hit them and killed them. So roads are a big part of this, both in Red Lake and Rainbow Lake. We also had 3 injuries from snares and conibears. In Rainbow Lake, a very similar story. 11 known mortalities, 8 were from fur harvest, where fur harvest is legal, 2 from predators, and 1 from a vehicle, as well as some injuries to individuals. We looked at wolverine survival between Red Lake and Rainbow Lake. So in Red Lake, we ended up monitoring the species for a little bit longer a period of time versus Rainbow Lake. So in Red Lake, we found annual survival to be fairly high, to the point where if you look at a population trajectory, it didn't indicate that the population would be declining. Those survival rates technically should support, based on our population modeling, which obviously has a lot of assumptions, but based on our population model, with those survival rates, the Red Lake population should have been somewhat stable. In Rainbow Lake, we monitored wolverines for about half the time, or a little bit more than half the time, and it had the same number of mortalities, but survival was, and as a result, survival was quite a bit lower. And our estimates were that the population trajectory there was declining. It's just important to know we had less data in Rainbow Lake, and that made our estimates much more sensitive to increases to deaths and to some of the data inputs. So it's a bit less robust what the data that we had from Rainbow Lake relative to Red Lake. We've done a little bit of work with trapping. We had a number of wolverines, 2 wolverines that had missing paws, and both M5 and M7, and we think it's because they stuck their paws into conibear traps for martens. We've had a number of wolverines get killed that way. They stick their paw into a trap and then they can't release it. But these ones we think were able to release, and they ended up losing their paws, their front right paws. After M5 had that happen, he did go for a long distance movement, a dispersal all the way up to Kanji and back. M7 was more local in his distribution. Both home ranges ended up being very near towns. So their home range actually encompassed some of the towns in our study areas, and both were ended up being killed in vehicle accidents. But we're looking at some of the differences in movement between these wolverines with missing paws and those wolverines with all their paws, try to see if to kind of look at some of the potential fitness effects. But overall, as you would expect, wolverines that have missing paws tend to not travel as far and on the landscape and have reduced movement capabilities, which obviously is going to have fitness effects. Okay, last section is physiology. Yeah, overall, I think there's 1 paper on wolverine physiology that's out in the literature, and Laura McCall works in my program and has a lot of experience with physiology, so she's been leading some of the research on this. We're generally interested in some physiological patterns in the species and also predicting reproduction levels with reproduction with progesterone. This is the first project that Laura's leading. It's a physiological validation, so we're just trying to understand what assay, whether corticosterone or cortisol, best predicts stress in wolverines. So we compare corticosterone and cortisol, between kind of controls and treatments or events. For example, what are these values at a cluster when a wolverine's out foraging on the landscape, when we collect some of its scat, versus when it's in a trap? And it was the same thing. We looked at these events. We worked with some zoos in the United States and looked at corticosterone and cortisol levels during relocations from cages to try to understand what hormone, what assay does the best job at at measuring when a stress event happens to the species. This is very important for kind of understanding um, how to look at some of the effects of industrial development on wolverines, for example. We need to know what hormone to look at, what hormone is most responsive to stress events, and so that's what this effort is mostly about. But overall, cortisol was an excellent assay. We're also doing some progesterone model. In essence, we went to these den sites and we followed these females through the bush during breeding season or during reproduction and not during reproduction. We collected their scat, and then we looked through that scat in collaboration with the Toronto Zoo to try to understand what progesterone levels were, to try to predict. And we also looked at progesterone levels when we knew the female was having kits and was in a den, so that we could try to build a model that could predict when progesterone peaked, which should happen during reproduction. And overall, we found if you were to go into the bush and you were to collect a scat, and it was a female scat, and that progestin level was above 8,200 nanograms per gram in its dried feces, you could probably say that that's a reproductive population and that female is having a kit. If you go in the bush during the reproductive period and the level of progestin in the scat is say below 1,700 nanograms per gram in the dried feces, that would indicate that the female is not reproductive. So this is important for environmental assessments. For example, when a proponent goes into an area and wants to develop a mine or something, and they want to understand whether there's a reproductive wolverine population in the area, they could collect scat after following females and try to understand whether their project area might be in an area where there's a reproductive female. We also looked at range-wide variability in stress hormones. So we looked at hair cortisol between Ontario, in Red Lake, in Rainbow Lake, and in Nunavut. Overall, we found the highest hair cortisol, generally occurred in Ontario. Alberta and Nunavut had fairly low cortisol levels. So this is kind of a surrogate for stress hormones. So again, we don't really know why this pattern might show up. But again, Ontario is the edge of the species range, and climatic conditions and development might make that type of environment physiologically more stressful for the species, and that might be showing up in this data. So wolverines as a wilderness species, started out talking about that, but much of what we are working on is relates to wolverine response to human disturbance. Both this Red Lake and this Rainbow Lake field site, they are heavily developed by commercial forestry and industrial developments. I think what I've always found really interesting is, they're thought of as this wilderness species, but they have these home ranges that often encompass areas with lots of human development. This wolverine here in Red Lake or Rainbow Lake, F8, she was kind of like an all-star during that study. She had multiple reproductive events, and she had juveniles that survived into adult, she had kits that survived into being subadults and juveniles. Yet her area where she lived was just heavily um, um, impacted by oil and gas wells, pipelines, cut blocks. Coming into this, I always thought of wolverines only existing in these very wild places. And both in Red Lake and Rainbow Lake, you see something different. You see wolverines living in these heavily disturbed areas. But I think as you kind of peeled it apart, yes, they exist in these areas, but their sustainability and the ability to exist in those areas for a long period of time really depends on the type and the magnitude of human disturbance that it's having on those populations. Not all human disturbances are the same. Non-lethal effects on wolverines sometimes have a bit of a muted effect on them. For example, human activity and roads, there might be some behavioral effects that displace wolverines and reduce habitat suitability. Some of the biggest effects are the human use of roads and of these landscapes for for recreation, for example, for trapping, for industrial activity, as you increase the human use of these landscapes, they start to have a big effect on wolverines. Overall, we see, we don't have a very good understanding of non-lethal effects on wolverines, and how that affects population sustainability. I think we're going to get there, but we have a very good idea that lethal effects have a clear link. So if you have a study area, um, with wolverines, and there is, um, a large industrial footprint, really how that industrial footprint's going to affect the species is really going to depend on how humans are using that landscape and some of the lethal effects that they're having on the individuals. But yeah, that's it. If anybody has any questions.
That was really great, Matt. Very interesting. I know there's not a lot of data in the past on Wolverines. They've been traditionally very hard to get data on. So we really appreciate you sharing all of this with us. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So Naya poses the question, have you noted any phenotypic differences between wolverines of the three primary habitat types?
No. Well, it's interesting. There was a bottleneck, for example, in the Finniscandia populations, like Norway and Sweden. There's a
Mhm.
genetic bottleneck at one time, and there's not wolverines there don't really have chest patterns for the most part. But in where we've worked, yeah, we haven't necessarily noticed that.
Okay, great. And then Ken has a question about primary predators of wolverines. So who are the primary predators?
Um, I would say wolves. We do see interactions, I mentioned roads are this interface where wolverines are often interacting with predators, interacting with humans as well as like natural predators like wolves. And so we do see wolverines killed by wolves. It's I talked about to understand the effect of an industrial footprint. It's important to understand the type and the magnitude. As far as lethal human disturbances are concerned, or lethal disturbance is concerned, like the predators and the vehicles, they don't they have a much less effect on wolverines, less effect on lethal effect on wolverines than the humans do in these areas. But
Yeah, great. Lindsay asks, regarding the wolverines eating moose, black bear, etc., are they hunting these big animals or are they scavenging them?
It's a good question. Yeah. There is a little bit of research, for example, from Alaska where wolverines will chase caribou for long periods of time and tire them out, and then are able to take them down. And we see during aerial surveys wolverines chasing after caribou, and we haven't actually seen evidence of them killing them, but we do see evidence that they will chase after them. But for the most part, it is wolf-killed ungulates that they're feeding on. Wolf-killed moose, wolf-killed caribou. I mean, a female's 20 pounds. She's not that
Yeah,
big. I mean,
yeah,
we even see, differences, male's 35. We see males much more likely to go after beavers, for example, because they have to dig through those lodges, and beavers can be quite big. Females, we don't see quite as much evidence of them going after beavers, but they're very good at killing snowshoe hare, and males don't always bother with snowshoe hare. So there's differences. And if you were to take down ungulate, I would imagine it would be a larger male that would try to attempt that. But
yeah, maybe taking down young, like
caribou
young,
calves and
yeah,
moose calves, I'm sure are part of wolverine diet in the spring.
yeah.
Um,
Are drones used much in these studies, or was most of this aerial work done by helicopter?
The aerial track surveys were done with fixed wing aircraft.
Okay.
There is some very good work done with drones in Alberta mountains and in the BC mountains looking for wolverine den sites. And you can do that because wolverines are denning up in the subalpine where there's not as much um, yeah, there's not as much tree cover. It's a little bit easier to see those den sites. In the boreal, it's a little bit trickier to try to find that. You can still do it. It just takes a bit more work. But we have not worked with drones very much. And those aerial surveys, for example, are over such a large distance that a drone wouldn't ever be able to do that. But I think drones are a very promising venue for the future.
Yeah, I agree. So Carrie asked this question, was WCS consulted at all by the Alberta government before they lifted trapping regulations? And do you have any suggestions on how to approach the government to be more considerate of science? Yeah, that's a big question that we would like to know as well.
I do think like the government is, yeah, it's like a blanket statement. And I would say the people that I've worked within the Alberta government, um, are very serious about conservation and helping wolverines and other species like caribou who are threatened there. Um, as far as like, being consulted before the regulation, that um, no, we weren't consulted. I wasn't necessarily expecting, we weren't really expecting necessarily to be consulted, but we have been part of working groups that are, for example, part of the federal management plan, and Alberta Wolverines are up for reassessment. And I have been a part of that working group to try to reassess the status of wolverines. And that also deals with trapping effects, broad scale and local scale. So we are a part of this. So, but we weren't directly consulted by the Alberta government before the trapping regulations were lifted. And the second
Yeah.
part of that question was, yeah, to,
Yeah, just about science. Is there some way to have you had success, I guess, in working with government, getting them to like really um, appreciate sort of the scientific information?
I mean, I think that's a lot of what WCS Canada is about, is trying to make inroads with government to try to apply the science that we collect, but also the science that we synthesize from the broader research community. Um, for example, in Ontario, there's these things called there's the environmental registry. It lists when new policy changes are happening that it might then, and we try to understand the ones that might affect wolverines or caribou or other species at risk. There's also, environmental assessments that are always ongoing, run by the Ontario government. We are actively commenting on those environmental assessments at every stage that we can. We're also commenting on any policy changes that might affect species at risk. And I think the government it does listen. And we do see that in as those policies and assessments go through iterations, we do see our comments incorporated into that. That's a big part of what we do. And I do see some hope there, and I do see government taking what we do our comments fairly seriously.
Yeah, I wish the Alberta government was equally amenable. Unfortunately, we don't seem to see that too much at the moment, but we are trying. We try our best, and on that note, like AWA works very hard to get the information out. We don't always get the information um, in a timely fashion from the government, so often we're sort of running behind after policies have been changed. But yeah, we appreciate the work that you guys do at WCS. I know that we rely a lot on data that's done by field scientists. So I just wanted to personally thank you for the work that you do for protecting species at risk.
Yeah.
On that note, are there any other final questions, or do you have a final comment you want to make, Matt?
No, yeah, I appreciate the, um, yeah, the ability to talk with everybody. And yeah, I think we are working, real hard with the government and in Alberta and elsewhere to try to, I think Wolverines often fly under the radar a little bit, and they don't rise to the same level as a lot of other species. And I think the work the WCS Canada is doing, but also all the researchers that are out, in Alberta and the Rockies and up into the Arctic tundra, we're all kind of trying to raise the profile of Wolverines to get them some additional protections.
Well, we appreciate you allowing us to record this. This will hopefully help inform other people. We always, get asked after the fact for, was it recorded? Can I see it anywhere? So we will push to get this up on our YouTube channel in a timely fashion. But I wish to really, again, reiterate how much we appreciate you taking the time and a time zone away to speak with us here in Alberta about your research.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
And there were lots of positive comments in the chat as well. So,
Yeah, I'll take a look. Thanks a lot.
okay. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yep.
Yeah, lots of thank yous.